Sergei Eisenstein, known as the father of montage, was one of the first to formalize the rules of film criticism. He's best known for his Soviet propaganda films, though he had a prolific career as a writer and brought an interesting use of editing and imagery into his films. Eisenstein was born in Latvia on January 3, 1898, to an engineer father and a free-spirited mother. His family moved around when he was a child, often following his father's job. He was doted on by his mother and ridiculed by his father. Eisenstein was a very fragile child, and one classmate described him, saying, "Physically, he was slightly built and rather frail. There was something rather feminine about his appearance, so that he often looked more like a girl than a boy." Eventually, his parents separated. His father represented attitudes of the wealthy class that he hated, and many speculate that his interest in Marxism began as much out of rebellion from his father as anything else. As a youth, he read everything he could get his hands on, and was particularly influenced by the literature and imagery of the French Revolution. When he was 12, he visited his mother and found books that she had hidden around the house in chairs and couches that contained images of bondage and torture, themes that often appear in his movies. Some really famous instances of this are when we see children being crushed during the Odessa Steps sequence of Battleship Potemkin, his frequent use of stage blood throughout his movies, and in the film October, we see horses hanging dead. Eisenstein was not afraid to explore the darker side of humanity. Eisenstein had infrequent romantic relationships with both men and women throughout his life. His films are peppered with homoerotic imagery. He struggled personally because of his sexuality and sought counseling about it throughout his life. In 1934, Eisenstein married his assistant after homosexuality became illegal in the Soviet Union. Eisenstein, as a Marxist, identified as an atheist, though he was raised in the Orthodox Church, and certainly understood and appreciated religious imagery. He often used Orthodox imagery in his films. Eisenstein, despite his comfort expressing his darker side, was also known for his sense of humor. He was witty and always ready to tell a joke regardless of its appropriateness. If I were to include all of the amusing anecdotes I've read about here, I would run drastically over the time limit and run afoul of the censors, but he had a great one he loved to tell about the sexual exploits of Lenin's wife that went on while Lenin was out of town. I think everyone thought it was funny except for Lenin. After trying to please his father, Eisenstein dropped out of engineering school to join the Bolshevik Red Army and was placed in the theatrical unit creating plays. After his military service, he returned to state school for stage direction and had a prolific stage career before switching to film. Eisenstein's early filmmaking was influenced by American D.W. Griffith, who is best known for the films Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. What appealed most to Eisenstein was Griffith's use of editing, particularly the technique of cross-cutting. Cross-cutting is cutting between different things happening in different places at the same time, usually to build suspense. The stereotypical example of this is cutting back and forth between a damsel in distress tied to the train tracks, a train barreling along toward her, and the hero riding to her rescue. Shots of these three would be intercut, and the audience understands the events are happening simultaneously, gradually building suspense until right at the last minute, all three are in the same shot, and the hero snatches the woman out of the way of the train. Eisenstein's contemporary, Lev Kuleshov, was also experimenting with montage at the time. Kuleshov was interested in the psychological effects of montage and on how editing could change the meaning of the shots themselves. Kuleshov performed a now famous experiment in which he used stock footage of an actor staring into the camera. He took that same image and made 3 different films. In one, he placed after the image that of a beautiful woman. In another, the image was paired with a bowl of soup, and in the third, with a dead girl in a coffin. Audiences of each film praised the actor's performance, exclaiming how you could see the desire and love for the girl in his eyes, or how hungry he looked while looking at the soup, and how somber he was staring at his dead daughter. From this, Kuleshov concluded that the editing and juxtaposition of images is as important, or even more important, than the performance of the actors themselves. My Film Studies 2 class has been studying the cognitive theory of film, which centers around editing and elements of montage, and they have made a modern rendition of the Kuleshov experiment. We chose for the soundtrack the music of Sergei Rachmaninoff, another of Eisenstein's contemporaries. As you can see, the experiment may not work today on more sophisticated viewers, but Kuleshov's results in the early 1900s led to a new type of filmmaking. In 1924, Eisenstein applied for and received a government grant to create a cycle of films about events that led to the Revolution of 1917. In Eisenstein's view of communism, the government would support artists whose creative whims would now be unlimited by constraints of budgets. Unfortunately for him, it did not work out that way, and he remained constantly at odds with the film board. His first film, Strike, was a propaganda film which he used to test his theories about montage. In one scene, he cross-cuts between images of the suppression of the striking workers and images of the slaughter of animals being butchered. This is clearly intended to cause viewers to psychologically connect the two events. The movie was a critical success, so he was able to receive funding to make his next film. In 1925, Eisenstein made the most famous of his films, Battleship Potemkin, to commemorate the uprising of 1905 in Odessa. The film was a fictionalized version of the uprising and showed the Tsarist soldiers murdering women and children on the Odessa steppes. Though Eisenstein took liberties with historical accuracy, the film was an effective piece of propaganda. In addition to being the most famous propaganda film of all time, it consistently ranks among the top films in the history of world cinema. Charlie Chaplin called it the best film in the world. Images from the Odessa steppe sequence have become iconic and are often parodied in other media, especially the image of the baby carriage rolling down the stairs. Eisenstein's personal filmmaking goals were often put on hold to make additional propaganda films, which he supported at first, but quickly became disillusioned about. While he supported Lenin, he did not support Stalin's regime. Apparently, he only wanted the torture and murder to be fictional. This led to a falling out with the Soviet Film Board. Eisenstein left the Soviet Union in search of artistic freedom and just to get away from the stifling control over his creative works. He traveled around the world and ended up under contract with Paramount Pictures in Hollywood, where things did not really work out. Paramount felt that his pictures were overly antagonistic and exceptionally critical of the American capitalist system, and they sent him packing. While he was there, he did make some friends in Hollywood, hanging out with classical Hollywood silent film stars, spending some time with Charlie Chaplin, and even Walt Disney and Mickey Mouse. These connections eventually led to a partnership with Upton Sinclair. Eisenstein went to Mexico to work on Que Viva Mexico with Upton Sinclair, but returned to the Soviet Union before it was completed. There's a little bit of controversy about why exactly he went back. Some say he was fired because of romantic affairs he was having on set. Some said that Stalin wrote Sinclair a letter and asked him to be sent back to Russia. But whatever happened, Eisenstein went back to the Soviet Union. Eisenstein was incredibly stifled upon his return to Russia. The film board felt that his theories about montage were elitist and inaccessible to the common man. They wanted realist movies and did not want to focus on the emotional impact of montage. Therefore, almost all of his proposals for projects were denied, including one that he wanted to make about an uprising in Cuba that was to star famous African-American socialist Paul Robeson. I'm personally very sad that never got made because I would really like to see it. His final films were very well received epics based on the lives of historical figures, most notably Ivan the Terrible. Stalin greatly enjoyed these movies, and so Eisenstein's career did have a bit of a resurgence late in his life. However, Eisenstein remained physically fragile throughout his life and died in 1948 while making Ivan the Terrible Part 3. All of the footage for Ivan the Terrible Part 3 has been lost. Ivan the Terrible Part 2 was released 10 years after his death, and Parts 1 and 2 run all together at maybe 6 hours. It's quite the epic. Interesting, but long. While Eisenstein is best known for his film making, he was also an important early film critic. Throughout his career, he taught off and on at what was then the All-Union State Institute of Cinematography, which was the first and now oldest film school in the world. He was one of the pioneers of film education and of film criticism as a discipline. He wrote many articles and books about filmmaking, and 2 of his books, The Film Sense and Film Form, remain required reading in many film schools today. He was known for his accessible, down-to-earth writing style, and while the topics covered in his writing are detailed and technical, he explains them in such a way that they are easily understood by the lay reader. Though he completed only 7 feature films during his career, he made numerous contributions to film and to the spread of Marxist ideals around the world. He developed many filmmaking techniques that are still used today, most importantly, the theory of montage. The last thing I want to leave you with is a quick little tribute to Sergei Eisenstein that my Film Studies 2 class came up with. They wanted to make a film in the style of montage, but without as much of the dark and dreary imagery, because we're just not dark and dreary people. So we put together a little tribute to Eisenstein, and I hope you enjoy it.
I was born one morning when the thunder did shine. I picked up a shovel and walked to the mine. I mowed it. said, well, bless my soul, you lost swang still dance, and what do you get? Another day all that live and dance. Say, Santa, don't you call me, 'cause I cannot go. I owe my soul to the company store.